So our next panel is about imagining how democracy could work. We want to take a moment to zoom out and think big picture about democracy. We're going through a critical time in history where our social institutions that were built in the past are not really meeting the moment. And we know that, but we have a hard time understanding how these social institutions can be improved. So there's a data point that for generations born before World War II, about 70% think that it's essential to live in a democracy, whereas for millennials, that number is just under 30%. So this means that we have to make democracy recognizably viable again, especially to young people, but for everyone. And to do that, it takes the recognition that democracy is not just an ideal, but it is a social technology that is in need and capable of evolution in many of the ways that Matt was describing and other ways as well. So in this panel, we're going to talk about how democracy to come could work and what it can look and feel like and how this imagination can inform the steps that we're going to take today. And so with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Matt Prewitt, and he's going to introduce our amazing panelists.
Thanks, Paolo. We'd love to invite our panelists up, Juha, Kazimierz, and Stav.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank you all again. Thanks so much for joining us in this conversation. Really honored to be speaking with you all today. I'll feel free to tell us a bit more about your work, and I'll as we get started. But very privileged to be joined by Stav Shaffir, who's I believe the youngest woman to be elected to the Israeli Knesset, and a leader of an incredibly inspiring major social movement in Tel Aviv concerning the high cost of housing and a number of other social issues about a decade ago, which is really one of the most successful examples of organizing in recent years. Juha Leppänen is the chief executive of Demos Helsinki, which is a really amazing consultancy and think tank that is doing some of the most innovative democracy work around the world. And Kazimierz Popławski is the founder of the Baltic Review, an expert and a scholar in the really amazing digital democracy and sort of e-democracy work that has gone on in Estonia in recent years. So thank you all so much for being here. And I think the question that I would like to start off with is, in addition to, feel free to sort of tell us a little bit more about your own work and what how it connects to this problem. But I would love to hear from each of you about sort of why you think democracy is so difficult and why you think it's under such unique pressures in recent years and what we might do about it.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really love your work at RadicalxChange, and looking forward to see the new innovations that you will come with. I think, well, the rise of populists that, after being elected, damage democracy in so many ways is not a new phenomenon. So, we're in a place where We know it happens. It happens everywhere. Sadly, we're not learning fast enough as citizens how to cope with this extremists when they try to take over and occupy power just in order to damage democracy. However, I think that there are other reasons why democracy was weakened in the last decade or even 2 decades already. Our generation that grew up into a technological world, we have internet access since we're like 5. We're used to having information in our hands, and the way of thinking of information is something that belongs to us. We want to have access, we want to have more control over our lives, but our political systems don't behave in the same way. Actually, they behave very much the opposite. They're very slow to progress, to adopt new technologies. They're very much left behind. So it's the public that is way ahead, like 1,000 steps ahead. But politicians and political systems that are left behind not acting. So the average citizen is left with one option to influence in his or her eyes, which is to go and vote once in 4 years, if you're lucky. We in Israel do it very often, like once in 6 months. But that vote alone is not really influence. We don't feel like it's influencing anything in our lives. And I think that disappointment, together with the rise of social media, where we're becoming much more aware of what politicians are actually doing, and the disappointment from the way the decisions are being made, led to a huge disappointment of democracy itself. So we hear more and more voices, even in more like liberal societies, against the essence of democracy, like it's not really working. And I think the way to move forward is for these systems to start and advance in different and creative ways. And it takes a lot of experimentation. It's not going to happen with, by using, and I was in politics for 8 years. Sadly, a lot of what I saw that was that politicians were constantly trying to learn from really the oldest guards in the in the place, like taking the same, adopting the same systems again and again and again that were already tried before, didn't succeed. We need new systems, and we need to change the way that we think about democracy. We need to look at it as an active, innovative force. It needs to happen every day in our lives. It needs to start early in our education, with democratic schools and democratic education, with the encouragement of the ability to make decisions and to learn to depth the core ideas behind these decisions. Because if you just vote on an idea, even in a referendum, like the example we had in Brexit, where Brexit was, the vote was defined in a 52 to 48% gap. But a day after the vote, the second most asked question on Google by people in Britain was, what is the EU? If people vote about something, but they don't know what they vote on, they're not actually using their power. It actually goes against their own interest and their own civil power. That's not democracy. It's not what it's supposed to be. So we need to start this training very, very early on. When I think we need to start it in our cities, we need to get, which have the highest potential of having people involved in their day-to-day life. So in the definition of their education, in the definition of the roads, in planning, like urban planning can be dominated and led by the people who actually live in the city and not by outsiders or you know, just by the professionals. It should be by the residents. And if we encourage people to do that and get them the activization in their day-to-day lives about how it can be done and can show fruits in their realities, I think it will encourage them to act more also on the national level and use the democracy in ways that we still haven't seen.
Super, thank you. Juha.
No, super good. Few reflections on that, and really privileged to be here, which is a super beautiful setup. Very, very, very lovely. So perhaps two perspectives to follow up on that. point. Well, first of all, I think we're dealing with very fundamentals of democracies, like the most basic questions that we've always dealt with when we talk about democracies. And so to me, democracy is one very particular way of orchestrating collective action. And one aspect of that collective action is problem solving. And on that, there are many different, more detailed aspects to it. But one is that if you look at our democracies, many of the issues that we're dealing with today escape their boundaries in a way, whether it's local, whether it's national. For instance, the climate crisis. And what that leads very easily in is a decline in agency. And that then leads into a decline in accountability. And it's a really particular dynamic. I remember very well when the discussions on future work were high everywhere, basically, around 8-9 years ago. And we did a project with our government and basically the key institutions in the Finnish society on work. And we launched that. And all of those institutions said that there's nothing we can do about this. There's nothing we can influence. There's nothing we can take accountability of in terms of fragmentation of jobs, for instance. So, and then you wonder why there is a decline of trust in those institutions. So there's that very fundament in terms of whether the modality of governance is capable of achieving what needs to be achieved in terms of solving the problems that we have today. But then, of course, collective action is more about solving problems. It's also about co-living. And there, I think, in a way, with democracy, we've a bit forgotten about both the strengths and weaknesses of democracy, which is that it's a very messy process. But at the same time, societies are fundamentally very messy, as they are. And in a way, during the past 20 years, a lot of the ways to answer to that decline of trust in democracies has been to put in place, for instance, participation methodologies, which then are on the fringes of the actual decisions and how we actually shape where we're heading collectively, which then leads easily into very banal examples of basically voting for putting in place a very specific park, for instance. And there's nothing wrong with parks, but it's much more about like what are the fundamentals of democracy and where the real power lies. And if we look at historically, democracies thrive when there's a process of imagination, debate, and experimentation, not just on the society, but on democracy itself. So partially, I think the reason why we're seeing a decline on democracies and trust in democracies is that we've forgotten to apply the very basic principles of democracy into the democratic process itself. Professor Roberto Mangapera Unger would refer to this as the dictatorship of no alternatives, which is very much self-imposed. And that, to me, is the biggest question. How do we exactly bring up that process of imagining collective life and action and share that power equally?
Super. Kazimierz.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. If we talk about democracy from Polish and Estonian perspective, I would argue with the previous argument of yours, I guess, or that society doesn't trust in democracy. If you would ask Polish people or Estonian people, majority of them would answer that we want to live in democracy. But that does not necessarily mean that we vote in a way that we ensure preserving democracy in our countries. As anywhere else in Europe or in the world, we have these populistic movements that are actually using democracy in order to limit of influence of societies on politics. And then there is a question on technology. And I think that, of course, private sector, society, people are using technology in a very wide extent. And we could argue that private sector is way ahead of public sector, of politics and politicians. But if you would analyze elections in US, in different countries in Europe, in Brexit, then you could see that actually those actors are employing technology in order to obtain power and maybe limit our democratic rights. So technology is not necessarily an answer to our current struggle. And coming back to a Central European perspective, Poland in particularly, there is a big question of obeying the law, the rule of law, basically, and how political actors using this in order to limit our rights, democratic rights. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. One I think interesting theory for the difficulties that democracy has been having recently, and for the role of technology in these, is that if you just sort of think of democracy as like an information system, if you think of in terms of information being passed from participants in democracy to whatever the sort of governed entity is, technology has increased the flows of information. It's made it much easier for lots and lots of information to inform all kinds of institutions, but private institutions and non-democratic institutions have had a much easier time taking advantage of that increased flow of information than democratic institutions have. So, for example, the way that Audrey Tong in Taiwan has put it is that the sort of bit rate of democracy has not increased, right? The input that we give to our democratic systems is still just a few votes every couple of years or something like that, whereas the amount of informational input that we're putting into technological platforms, the amount of information that markets are taking in, for example, has increased just exponentially. So that means that democracy is just at a disadvantage to these other kinds of institutions if it doesn't figure out how to take in more information. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about this sort of theory of the problem, and whether it's possible to whether it's what we might do to help democracy keep up with these other systems.
No, it's a very interesting hypothesis. I think, well, it's one part. I think there's a risk if we only think of democracies through metaphors of information systems, because it's much more symbolic, there's much more perceptions and experiences at play. But then again, there is that aspect as well. And I think it's quite nuanced, actually. Of course, if we look at it on a very kind of like macro level, that would be the case, that the input values would be quite rude. At the same time, when we look back, for instance, when democracies responded to the wave of telecommunications technologies that emerged, it was a process of institutional design that took a decade or 15 years just to put in place the structures, the basic agencies, in order to be able to regulate and understand the nuance with those technologies. I think that's the process where we are right now. And then what I'm worried about is, well, first of all, how long it takes, because now the pace seems to be a bit faster. At least the existing institutional landscape and culture seems not to be able to grapple with all those dynamics that are at play. For instance, in the fragmentation of the media landscape, which is a really difficult problem for the current democratic institutions, because it goes on to a level of perceptions that are very difficult to deal with a formal electoral system, for instance. But that doesn't mean that it's not taken into account. It's just taken into account in pockets, and it's not that visible. But perhaps to that point, it would be that there is that process of institutional design. It takes time, because that's one of the key features of democracy. And then what the end results will be most likely vary quite a bit on context.
Yeah, I mean, I think another sort of theme that comes up in this context is like, so there's a lot of talk about sort of education and like the inculcation of like a democratic culture or a democratic spirit. And this is, for example, this is something that John Dewey was really interested in, was like, how to kind of create a culture of interaction and communication between people in which democracy could thrive. But I think it's difficult, because there's obviously something to that, but I also worry about that a lot, because I don't think it will. I'm not sure that we. I mean, first of all, I just worry about basically going to societies and saying that there's something wrong with the way that people are interacting with their politics, right? I don't think you want to blame people in that way, first of all. And second of all, I actually think that that with better sort of fora for participation, with better, you know, if we have better spaces of participation, people actually will, you know, part of the reason people don't embody the democratic spirit is that they don't have an outlet to do so, right? They don't have any forum in which they can do that. And so, you know, Stav, I know you have thought a lot about like the role of cities and local government in this, and I don't know if you have thoughts about participation in local government as this kind of a sort of a forum for participation.
Yeah, many thoughts about it, but before that, I want to say something about your question. I think it goes back to the most, well, I think it's the most basic question about politics and leadership, and that's the fact that eventually most people choose to not be active. Most people choose to not go to that demonstration. Most people choose to stay at home. Most people, I mean, and we see also more and more that people choose not to even go and vote for the national elections. Municipal elections are even a harder temptation to get people to vote. But it goes even beyond that. We have an incredible tech industry around the world. But how many of the people who are actors in this industry, that lead the industry, dedicate an hour a week to use the skills that they have, the talents that they got, in order to improve democratic practices, in order to influence the society that they live in? I remember something that was really painful, I think we talked about it a few days ago, when in the Great Hack, the documentary that was made about Cambridge Analytica, a company that used personal data on Facebook to become very influential in national elections in different countries. I think it's in over 60 countries. They helped Trump win, they helped Brexit be passed, they participate, Bolsonaro in Brazil, they helped a lot of populist leaders to win using that personal data on Facebook and changing, basically focusing on swing votes. And the Great Hack documentary starts with that woman, her last name is Kaiser, and she's in Burning Man. She's in a festival that's all about free love and openness and a community, and she defines herself as a liberal. She volunteered for the Obama campaign when she was a student, but then she became a manager at Cambridge Analytica. And when she goes back from that Burning Man, she goes back to the company that she works for, and she participates in helping Trump win using that personal data. She participates in all of these actions that promoted very, very populist, anti-democratic leaders around the world. She made a complete separation. I mean, after that, she became and defined herself as a whistleblower, but that was only after the whole thing exploded. She, as a person with those very democratic values, decided to act in her profession, in her job, completely for the other side. And I could never get that separation that people make in their lives. Because we are, as citizens, we're always citizens. It's not like our citizenship ends when we go to work. We're citizens there. And I think I see in the tech industry and in the startup industry, also in my country, in Israel, a lot of people who go to a very libertarian ideology. So they distance themselves ideologically from the sense of government and why it's important, instead of using the skills that they have to help change government. Government really needs to be fixed, definitely. It's not working well in many, many, many places, but it needs that creativity to act. And I think that's part of the reason that brought me to believe in the potential of cities. I think because governments are now, in so many places, are in complete chaos. If it's ongoing election rounds, if it's ongoing shifts of power and the lack of ability to promote serious ideas and policies, but municipalities are in a different place. They have much more stability. Sometimes they're even being ignored, but by mistake, or not taking enough power into their hands, but they have the potential of doing that. We saw it when Trump left the Paris agreements, and 2,000 municipalities in the US decided to join and take on climate responsibility, because that's what their people asked them to do. So municipalities today can actually lead. They can lead the world. They can create collaborations in between them. They can share tools. They can show, they can do participatory budget, for example, which is the best training to make people. That's when the municipality gives certain neighborhoods, usually the lowest income neighborhoods, a certain amount of their budget, of the municipal budget, to make a decision, a democratic decision in the neighborhood, what they want to build. And that process, if it's done well, it's a process that's really educating the city to participate, because it gives them power, it gives them a sense of success. They suddenly see that something can actually work, and they created it, and it's exciting. And I think it goes from there. It's by making democracy exciting. It will not work just because, you know, it has this idea of importance, because then people make it very superficial. Democracy is much more than just the majority vote. But it will work if it will become sexy and exciting again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important, so first of all, RadicalxChange does a lot of work with cities precisely because they have an ability to be a little bit more experimental. And I also think an important idea here is that it's important for democracy to happen sort of in this, at many different levels of sort of distance from the individual. So if you think about, I mean, it's particularly acute in the United States. You can feel the enormous scale gap between the, you know, democracy of 350 million person society and the individuals. Just, it feels, and what's interesting about it and quite scary is that the sort of national level inspires huge passion. People are extremely passionate about it, and yet they actually feel like no sense of responsibility for it. So there's this sort of gap between how much you care about it, how passionate you feel about it, and how much responsibility you feel for what happens at that level. Because it's just very hard to take seriously the idea that what I do has any impact at an institution of that scale. So having these other kinds of, having democracy really functioning and flowing at these sort of meso levels of society, I think is incredibly important. I want to make sure, I would love to, I think important ingredient in this conversation is to hear a little bit about the greatly admired work in Estonia, which is, you know, one of the leaders in the world in terms of creating new methods of participation. And Kazimierz, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Estonia is the poster child of digital administrations, e-states, and so on. Basically, if I would use one of PR messages of Estonian government, they always claim that Estonian citizen can do anything online except two things: getting married and getting divorced. So that's two public services that they are not offering online. And indeed, Estonians for more than 20 years, they employ all kinds of services. They can do basically anything. And one of the services they offer is online voting, internet voting. And I guess it's the only country in the world that offers this opportunity. They introduced online voting as a way of casting vote in 2005. So it's already 17 years that they use this. So far, they didn't have any problems with this, but I have some thoughts on this. And one of my thoughts is that this, or conclusions from observing the process, is that this digital solution helped people who already know and plan to cast a vote. So they need to have their candidate that they want to vote for. And the introduction of internet voting haven't really influenced turnout, only to some small level. So in Estonia, usually in national elections, turnout is somewhere between 55 and 65%, which is pretty good for Central European countries, but in comparison with Western European countries, they are still lagging behind in terms of in terms of turnout. Introducing internet voting haven't really influenced on a form of government. It haven't changed the role of citizen in share of power. It haven't really increased accountability of political agents, political parties, politicians, and so on. So in this case, technology is a facilitator that helps those who already have agency, that those who want to participate in elections, but does not necessarily influence democracy as a whole.
Do you think there's something do you think that there's something that it's missing? Do you think that there's something that the Estonian government could do or should do to make it better and to make it, you know, something that affects more people's sense of responsibility for the outcomes, or no?
For the turnout, or for more active participation in the democratic process?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm interested in more than just turnout is sort of whether it changes the character of the society, right? Whether the availability of these new tools and new forums for participation has affected the.
There are more services than iVoting that were supposed to influence democratic process in Estonia. One, I should mention that about the approach that the Estonian state employed. Basically, everything that they introduce as a digital service, public e-service, is conducted in top-down approach. So basically, the government is deciding, like, let's introduce iVoting, and they are introducing iVoting. Let's introduce e-notary system, and they are doing this. It's probably completely different than we would prefer as a democratic-oriented societies to have these grassroots initiatives, down-to-top approach, bottom-up approach. But in Estonia, it's different way, and it's fascinating that people trust these services, and they accept them, they use them. But that does not increase their feel of connection or need to participate even more in democratic process just because there is iVoting. Estonian governments over the years, over more than 20 years, offered 3-4 platforms for online participation in legislative process and in public consultations. The first one they introduced was 2001. It was called TOM, abbreviation from Estonian for Today I Vote, but it failed. People didn't want to use this. But I found, I read one opinion that it was too early to implement such a platform. It was 3 years before Facebook, and the author who claimed that it was too early, he actually claimed that society didn't know how to use this. But despite this, there were other platforms that the Estonian government introduced over the years, and people really didn't use them in a way that government wanted to. The recent initiative is called Rahva Algatus, introduced in 2014, and it was introduced after national brainstorming. What Estonian society could do differently in order to make the Estonian democracy work better. And actually this national brainstorming ended up with very little result. So if I remember correctly, the initiative was of president of the country back then, and but this Rahva Arvatus was one of the effects of this national brainstorming, and the effects of this platform are more or less 10 up to 15 legislation initiatives that end up in parliamentary agenda, and I have data only of first 4 years of working of this platform. So over the first 4 years, only 2 ideas end up as they were introduced as a law in the country. One of them was dedicated to preserving biodiversity in the country. The other one I don't remember. So very little effect. So these new technologies, platforms, they actually haven't influenced, they haven't made Estonian society participate more. And I mentioned before that all of the digital services are introduced in this top-down approach, and one of the conclusion or lessons from this is that new technology doesn't really help society participate more, and in Estonian society, people who use them are actually consumers of what the government offers them.
Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction that I'm interested in a lot of contexts. The distinction between sort of thinking of a government as a service provider versus thinking of the government as something of which I'm a part, for example, right? And so
exactly. One of the conclusions of scientists who were investigating these platforms in University of Tallinn was that these platforms need to have measurable result, or result that could be materialized in a way that people who participate in this, they feel that they had their part in introducing new law or certain change. And previous platforms, they didn't provide this. So people felt kind of detached. So people need to feel that they are part of the process in order to own the platform or own the tool.
And so I'm just curious, like how would you sort of, from a broader point of view, how would you characterize this sort of health of Estonian democracy compared to peer countries? And has the work on digital democracy sort of made any difference one way or the other in that regard?
So if we talk about digital democracy, and if we would take the definition of digital democracy as a system where new forms of communication and providing information is employed, then Estonia is doing very well. But it doesn't influence much of agency in individual citizens. So that's one point. The other point is that I would say that Estonian democracy is doing really well in general terms. In these more traditional, broader terms, the media landscape is, for such a small country, is quite diverse, and media are basically free. In ranks of media freedoms, Estonia is top 5 in the world right now. If you would compare media landscape, they are in the same group as Scandinavian countries or New Zealand and so on. So the most liberal and the most free countries. Internet freedom, they are also top 5, top 10. Economical freedoms is Estonia is all in all of these ranks in top 10, top 15, top 5. They have very good education system, and there is a very high level of digital literacy, which help them use all these tools. But despite this, the country and the society has problems very much similar to any other countries. So, for example, Poland is not that advanced in terms of e-state as Estonia, but we have very similar problems concerning new political movements, populistic movements, or politics based on emotions and conflict rather than idealistic politics that we have a little bit maybe in 90s. So, these traditional or global problems are also there, but so far Estonia is doing, in my opinion, very good. They still are able to discuss very pragmatic problems on the level of national politics. Their society is able to influence political agendas. They have a number of issues that there is broad consensus, and these are actually very good ideas. Like, there is very broad consensus that education needs to be on a very high level, that they have to invest in ICT technologies in public and private sector, that they have to maintain freedoms of media, of doing business, of freedom of speech, and so on. So it's in comparison with Central European countries, they are doing good. There is, of course, quite a lot to do. Maybe in terms of social education, in order to make people be more active in terms of participating not only in elections, but also in political process and decision-making processes.
Thanks. Would love to open it up to questions, if anyone would like to ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one. You mentioned before, you mentioned that you thought it was fascinating that the people were using the tools that were provided by their government as if they had to adopt them, or why was that?
Could you repeat? I haven't heard you.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So you were talking about how... Perfect. So you were talking about how the government is providing these e-services from the top down, right? And that you've found fascinating that the citizens just accepted those tools.
Yeah, okay.
Why is that?
I would say that there is many factors that are behind this. It's basically a question of trust. Society, citizens trust their government. They not necessarily trust politicians or political parties, but they trust their government as an institution, state as an institution, and numerous institutions like police, courts, schools, and so on. They trust their institutions. And I think there is a lot of political, cultural, and historical context to this. Why they trust. So basically, Estonia regained independence in 1991 after half a century of Nazi and Soviet occupations. So they don't have memory of their own government betraying them or breaching their trust. They associate this negative impact, these negative phenomena or actions with Soviet rule, which Estonian society always took as a foreign invading power. So when they started their reforms in the 90s, they were, finally it was their own government. Their own people were governing. The other factor, it might be that they are a very small society. They are just 1.3 million people. So if you have so small society, you have to trust each other because most probably they are your friends, relatives, and so on. And it's probably more difficult to to betray in such a small society. The other factor is education. They put from the very beginning huge pressure on educating people, not only reforming schools, providing schools with computers and so on, but they offer digital literacy courses also for adult citizens. And the digital literacy is on very high level in Estonia, so maybe they know better how to use them, but it still doesn't translate on higher participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Hello? Thank you so much. We're going to close the panel here, and now we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:30 for a conversation on user agency in democratic data. So you can go take a break, grab a coffee, and come back here in 5. And thank you so much.